Sorry, I thought it was going to automatically unmute me. Let me start over. Well, thank you all for being here today for our virtual panel discussion. We're going to talk about driving value from customer and employee service tools. I want to start out, before I introduce myself, I know that we certainly have a lot of folks in the healthcare industry that are attending. So when I kind of use the term customer, for those in more of the healthcare space, kind of equate that to your patient satisfaction as well. So I wanted to be inclusive of all industries here. But I'm Catherine Huddleston. I'm the Vice President of Client Success and Operations at Work Institute. We're a workforce research and consulting firm, and we focus on more of the employee feedback aspect and driving action with that type of data. So I'll let each of our panelists introduce themselves. So first I'll turn it over to my colleague, Danny Nelms.
Thanks, Catherine. So thank you all for joining us today. My name is Danny Nelms. I'm the president of Work Institute. Been with the company for a little over 10 years, so really feel like I've cut my teeth on the employee feedback space and the employee experience space. So, and Tony and I worked together years ago, and really looking forward to just kind of an open discussion today and learning a little from each other. And I think our industries can learn from each other. So really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, my name is Tony Bodoh, and I run a consulting firm. Apologize, my phone there. I run a consulting firm, Tony Bodoh International. We've been around for, I guess, 11 years now, and I've got about 20 years of experience in the customer research space, first behavioral research, and over the last 13 or 14 years, it's been in the really customer feedback space and bringing those two worlds of qualitative and quantitative data together. And so worked with a lot of different companies. Healthcare, as Catherine mentioned, is one of the industries I've worked with. Financial services, hospitality, a wide range, probably about 30 different industries. And I've written a couple books on the topic from different perspectives.
Great. Well, let's just start simple. This question is for both of you, so feel free to kind of go back and forth, or one of you can start and then the other. But just tell me a little bit about the trends that you're seeing in both the customer and employee feedback spaces.
Tony, you go first.
Absolutely. So yeah, a couple of the trends that I'm seeing, if you go back about 10 years ago, maybe even a little bit longer, like I used to work for Gaylord Hotels back in 2007, 2008, and that's where I really cut my teeth on customer experience from the survey perspective. We had surveys that were going out. They were still in the manual survey, hand cards and things like that. People were hand coding these things. We had a team in Ohio that would go through, read every card, and then on a tick sheet kind of check off what category was being talked about. I was responsible at that point in time in 2007 to 2008 of really turning on a text mining platform where we actually used software to mine through over 100,000 pieces of feedback for 50 different businesses that Gaylord owned at the time. And so it was a massive effort, but it was one where we were kind of the cutting edge. We were one of the first hotel companies to actually do that and understand what customers were saying. We had to write all the rules by hand. We had to understand and parse language. So I got very good at understanding what different pieces of language meant as people used it. If you fast forward about 5 years ago, the space changed from the customer experience side, where a lot of it, they started getting into machine learning, and AI began to really show up as a big piece of it. So that led to where we are today, where most companies that are using a text mining platform, some of the more advanced, larger companies that can do that, they're typically not even writing rules. They're just letting the AI do the work for them. What happens though, you kind of have this lag there. And in the smaller companies, or companies that are not as well funded, may not have as much data, they don't have enough for AI to work with. So they're still kind of manually doing it, or using, they might be using a text platform, but they're building the rules themselves. So we're seeing that shift. I would say from that perspective, in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see probably a pretty significant shift, because AI will be, in some cases, smart enough to start analyzing the feedback of even smaller companies. And as Amazon and Google and others like that, as they built their AI engines, make that more available to people, I think we're going to see some more changes there. That's one perspective. That's kind of the analytical perspective. On the other side, you've got this element of creating the survey, right? And I usually think of it as like as a little pyramid, if you will. You've got the analysis, which happens afterwards, which is a space that I get deeply involved in. I know, Danny, you guys are involved in that space on the employee side. One of the other legs of that triangle, though, are the tool and the questions that you ask. And so it takes a level of expertise to write those questions. And now a lot of the firms out there, like SurveyMonkey and others like that, have pre-written questions for you, so you can grab those and put those in your survey and send your survey out. And then the kind of the third piece is the audience, selection of the audience. Now you might say, well, I'm just going to, reach out to all my employees, all my customers. That may or may not be the right thing to do. And to be able to know how to select the audience, how often to survey them, all of those types of things, those are really manual things right now that expertise is really involved with. The writing of the questions is something that you've got experts, but you can kind of do it. It's almost like a DIY method with some of the tools that are out there. I see that progressing. But what really is missing in a lot of cases yet today is this strategic understanding of, what do I want to do with the survey, and what do I really want to achieve in the end. On the customer experience side, I could write a survey and focus it so that I draw more information and that helps me with marketing, or I could go the other direction and get more information that helps me with operations improvement. And the average person wouldn't recognize the nuances in the questions. And so I that's kind of where we started from. The analytical side is really probably the most advanced part of this. And they're trying to push it now back into audience selection. They're trying to push it back into the question design and tool design. But there's a lot there that still needs human expertise because the tools aren't yet ready. That's what I see in the customer experience world.
And I'll just jump in to echo that. I see this, and I have this conversation constantly. Some people think we spend all this time building a customer feedback program, an exit interview program, an employee engagement program, and we spend hours and hours figuring the questions, getting the data, blah, blah, getting it spun up, but then there's no time, energy left, or lack of strategic understanding of what to do with the data. So it's like we've invested all this time and money, and then it just falls flat. And you get so many reasons why, but it's just the tale that I hear, seemingly every day.
And I think that's, to Catherine's point, I think the trend in the employee experience world that we're seeing is that companies are wanting to collect more data. And so, and I would say that AI tools for text analytics are starting to be present and are starting to have some impact on our industry. I think the challenge is that, maybe more so than in the customer experience world, the qualitative feedback from employees is a little more nuanced, and it can have a lot of different context from maybe just the fact that, I bought a product, now I want to give you feedback on that single product, right? And so you can be a little more specific, where if you ask an employee about their supervisor, for example, I mean, that can go in so many different directions in terms of why they feel the way they do about their supervisor. But the big trend that we're seeing is this idea of the voice of the employee or continuous listening. And so we're seeing all of these companies spin up that are either pulse surveys or pulsing mechanisms, and they're trying to get more and more and more feedback from employees all across the employee life cycle. So everything from maybe finding out how those employees feel when they were being recruited into the company, to what's the early stage look like, to then, some companies are looking at getting feedback every week or every day. I mean, something as simple as, you see the smiley face, frowny face, that sort of thing, where you're clicking your sentiment on a daily basis. And what I think we're seeing is that companies are becoming overwhelmed with data. And so they actually have so much data that they don't really know what to do with it from an analysis standpoint. And I think, to Catherine and to your point, Tony, it's like, well, what are we collecting this data for? What is it we're really trying to do from the standpoint of improving the employee experience? And I know in our world, employee retention is a space that we work in significantly. And, so many times we get calls from prospective customers saying, well, we want to do exit interviews. It's like, well, why do you want to do these? And they're like, well, we really are struggling with retention. Well, okay, then let's talk about the retention issue and what we need to do. And exit interviews are likely to be a part of it, but that may only be a tiny piece of it, which is the collection of that data.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, one of the things that I see, and I'm kind of hearing the same thing from you, Danny, there is there's a focus, too much of a focus on a metric, like in customer experience. Could be net promoter score, or it could be ease of use score. There's about 3 or 4 common ones: CSAT, or customer satisfaction, and that may tell you where a person is at in a given moment in time, but it does not get into the why. And that's the quantitative side of it. The qualitative side is, why do I feel this particular way? Why am I promoting you? Why am I a detractor? What's going on? And I think that's the piece of it where if you look at what's happening, this continuous monitoring, people don't want to fill out a ton of commentary. So I may have a happy face or a sad face, but do I know why? And that's really a challenge I see in the over surveying or the continuous listening process. There's definitely some benefits to it, but I see it happen so much that it becomes almost useless because we don't know what the data actually means.
I think that's where, from our perspective, we believe that there's an opportunity to listen continuously, but we actually suggest that it's in very specific employment stages. So yes, we need to get some feedback sometime in that onboarding phase. Yes, we need to be doing an exit interview. Yes, we need to be doing some sort of an annual study, but those actually can be different in certain ways. And so our onboarding and our exit interviews are very qualitative heavy, right? We really want to understand that early stage experience, and we want to fully understand why people are leaving and their perceptions. Sometimes that annual study can be a little more quantitative heavy, so that we're just getting kind of a baseline of where people stand in general. And then we'll supplement that with things like stay interviews, so that we can get, again, that high quality data. Keeping in mind that anytime we ask a quantitative question, generally in those qualitative heavies, we'll say, well, how did you rate your supervisor? Well, I rate them as poor. Well, why did you rate them as poor? And we really get the story behind it.
Yep. Kind of on the same topic, this question really is more for you, Tony, because I know the perspective that Danny has as well. One of the growing trends I'm seeing, especially as companies are going to kind of the more universal survey technologies, right? So it's more of a, whether we'll use SurveyMonkey as the traditional, kind of version, but all of those kind of survey technology, SaaS companies, and they can really have unlimited abilities to deploy surveys. I'm seeing many organizations, the term I'm using, just kind of a lack of governance over it, right? Oh, so I have access, you have access. I don't know that you just deployed this survey last week to this population, and I actually just deployed another one, and there's some overlap. And so it's a little bit chaotic, which is, again, lending itself to more data, no strategic focus. Just curious if you're seeing that in the customer satisfaction realm as well.
Oh yeah, that is a huge problem. It's only getting worse, I'll tell you, to be honest with you, because as you said, everyone thinks the answer is listening through a survey. And honestly, there are so many different ways that we can be listening to customers. And usually when I'm working with clients, I had one actually in the healthcare field. We worked with them, started working with them late last year. And the fundamental question they had was, okay, we're doing a survey on an annual basis. We're doing surveys, kind of exit surveys when our customers or clients are leaving. What else do we need to be doing? And so we actually stepped back from it and tried to understand, what is it you want to accomplish? Let's look at all the possibilities of what's out there. Let's look at what you're trying to drive with this. Well, retention was a big piece of one of the drivers. So what's the right time to ask those questions? And if you have a retention survey that goes out, let's say 60 days before their membership for this particular healthcare company, it was a membership based. If we do it 60 days before, when do we make sure we haven't surveyed them transactionally, or these kind of pulse survey, right? You have to go through and think through all the business rules around this. And yes, you need to have someone, for a Fortune 100 company, one of my roles was as the consultant to go there and help them understand how to govern the data, both the data that came out of the surveys, but also how to govern the surveys that were being done, how we were going to process that data. I mean, that was a massive task to really think about, because we were listening. I think we had 46 different points that we were listening, surveys and other continuous listening tools, emails, et cetera. And to be able to step back from it all, strategically look at it and say, what do we need to gain from this information? What can we stop asking? Prime example is, at least in the customer field, and there's definitely examples in the employee space. What questions do you already know the answers to that you don't need to ask? Like, if I'm sending a survey to a customer, I know who the customer is. I know what they purchased. I know when they purchased last. I know how much they've purchased. I know a whole lot about them. If I have to ask those questions, I am burning through their willingness to stick with me. So if I can eliminate a bunch of that stuff and just focus on the core, but now that requires I have data connected in the back end so that I don't have to ask these questions. And that takes IT, that takes strategic thinking, that takes a whole lot of agreement between different departments. So I'm making it sound a little complex because frankly, it is complex. If you're a small company and you're doing a survey here and there, it's probably not as big a deal. But once you start growing at all and where you're starting to think about retention as an issue, yeah, you've got to be thinking about how does this strategically play into what we're doing, and how do we ask the questions, and what's the right method of asking questions? Do we want to do it as an interview versus do we want to do it as a survey? Sometimes a survey is the right tool. A lot of times it's not. And I think that's just something that we've got to be aware of.
Yeah, kind of to add to the point of Catherine, we've seen in a couple of clients, one in particular that I'm thinking about, and this was a little more than a year ago, but not only were they asking, I think it was like 17 different times they were asking for employee feedback, but they actually had 9 different partners / vendors they were using to get at that too. So, I mean, there's just so much noise and so much activity around it. And, you know, we certainly are seeing a trend to try and pull that all into one partnership potentially. So, you know, companies, again, going and talking about the continuous listening model. So they're saying, we can do your onboarding, we can do your annual engagement study, we can do your exit surveys. I think the one thing we see is that there's also very specific ways that you need to conduct certain surveys. So, and Tony, I really am going to latch onto your point about when do you do interview versus survey. The exit interview, for example, is a space we really see an opportunity to dig a little deeper. And, you know, we still do about probably 70 to 80% of our exit interviews are done telephonically. So we're actually still reaching out to them and talking to them about their experiences. But it really, you know, we have to sort of chase them to get them to respond. And we see clients that go to just a traditional survey that they're just not getting response rates. So people are not, you know, they're not getting enough data, quite frankly, to make good decisions around it. And so, again, you go back to this thing you keep talking about. What is the strategy? What are we trying to accomplish? If we understand that, then we can sort of hone in on what we need to do. And we might need 1 vendor, we might need 3 vendors, but it's all about what are we ultimately trying to accomplish with getting the feedback that we're getting.
And an additional piece of that, you know, that as we look at this, I think one of the considerations you have to have is the psychological state of your employee. The same thing is true with customers, right? If you have an employee who has left the company, they could be leaving in an angry way, and so that survey they may just ignore it, right? So you end up getting a biased respondents to the survey. They could be leaving for a better job. You don't know the conditions necessarily that you're sending the survey into. And without knowing those conditions, who knows what the bias is? Like from a customer experience side, if we do surveys, we have to analyze and understand the context that we're surveying. We have to understand who we're sending it to, and we can't overweight one versus the other. Like if we sent surveys out and we tend to have, let's say, 60 or 70% of women respond versus men, there's a problem in that. And so when you're looking at exit interviews and those types of things, you've really got to be careful how you do that. You've got to understand how that works. And I think that's where also the interview goes deeper, which I think is a really powerful tool to use. The interview goes deeper and it can pull out that emotion. It can pull out things that a survey just, no matter how smart the survey tool is, it can't, because it's not real-time listening, if you will. And I think it's interesting. I'm gonna jump on this for a second and probably go off a bit of a tangent. We talk about continuous listening. Let me reframe that. For most companies, it's continuous asking, but there's very little listening happening.
Great point. A really good point. Because if you're really listening, then you're also likely to do something. And I mean, that's where, again, going back to your strategy discussion, it's like, one of our biggest challenges and one of the things that we see in the employee experience world is that there's a lot of asking and there's a lot of getting of employee feedback in terms of the actual action or taking and changing things, making them different. I'm not even going to say better. I'm just going to say making them different. I mean, the number of clients we've had over the years who would say, well, we're going to stop doing, say, exit interviews. And we'd say, well, why are you going to stop? And they'd say, well, the data never changes. And it's like, well, you probably never actually acted on that data because if it isn't changing, then you're not doing anything. So it's interesting.
Absolutely. Kind of on that same topic, we often see organizations that have they boast their high patient satisfaction, their customer scores, their high engagement scores, but yet customer retention is a problem. Employee retention is a problem. What do you guys think about perhaps some of the reasons why those data points are so frequently misaligned?
Well, I'm going to take that one first because I think that I think part of the challenge we have here is how we're trying to define engagement. And, I would even venture to say that it's hard to define it at all. In fact, if you go to 10 different consulting firms around this idea around engagement, you're probably going to get 10 different definitions. And I would say if you went to 10 different employees, those employees would also define it differently. So when we're trying to measure something that can't even really be defined, then I think a lot of times this idea that we've got high engagement is a misnomer. And so we're actually getting high turnover or low employee retention because one doesn't inform the other because we're sort of making up this definition of engagement. So again, I think you've got to look at it in two different ways. And from our perspective, we look at what are those drivers of engagement, not trying to look at some magical score that comes out of it. What are those drivers? Let's look at those independently, and then let's figure out what we can do about improving around those drivers and really focusing on that. So I think that's where you get this incongruency of, yeah, we've got high engagement, but yeah, we've got high turnover, and that's because they're not connected in any way. And I think some of it even goes back to irresponsible surveys. I mean, Catherine, you and I know well, one particular client where they said the magic question was, I think the word they used was, are you invested in the success? Are you committed to the success of this company? And like 90 some odd % would say, yes, I'm absolutely committed to the success. And yet their turnover is 40% or something. So, one more point, I want to get to your response, Tony, but I think the other thing, and Tony, I'd be interested to see what you see in the customer experiences. I also don't think we're holding ourselves to a high enough standard in the employee experience world. And so I've told this story literally dozens of times, but I was visiting a client, I was presenting some data to them from our annual retention report. And all morning long, they talked about an excellent safety program. They talked about excellent customer experience. Everything was about excellent. And then when they got to the employee experience, suddenly the verbiage changed and they were talking about favorable. So then it was a favorable responses, right? So no longer were we expecting excellence from the employee experience. And so I think when you don't expect excellence, then a lot of times that's where you get the high turnover as well.
There's a lot there I want to dive into. So yeah, let me tap into the first part of it. One of the things that most often, and I will qualify, I am not a statistician. I never claim to be. I do a lot of data science work, but I am not a statistician. But the one rule I've learned, do not confuse causation and correlation. And there are a lot of questions on surveys that can be correlated. As an example, customer experience questions that I see quite often, they do correlate quite often, but not always, is was this an excellent experience, right? To use a simple question. And then they'll ask another question, was this an excellent value? most often, if I've had an excellent experience, I'm probably going to say it has excellent value. But not always. We know that there's a drop off. It could be anywhere from 10 to 20% that say this was an excellent experience, but it was not an excellent value, right? If we're like using the top end of the spectrum. But if I flip it around, value always drives experience. I don't find value, high ratings on value and poor ratings on experience. So being able to understand, is it unilateral, bilateral, all of these types of things, right? That's where you actually need the statistical analysis to be done. But there's some other interesting things that happen. And I'll use the customer experience world as part of this. We worked with a resort company at one point in time. And as we were doing the research, we found that those, actually it was a resort company that had a timeshare component. And so their timeshare members who had committed to, a lifetime of membership basically with this organization, they tended to give lower satisfaction scores. And the company was really worried about this. Senior leadership said, well, why are they giving us such low scores? And as we got in and actually looked at the real feedback, what the comments that they were making, it's because they were committed that they gave lower scores. What they wanted, they said, we don't want you to become a worse company. We see something slipping here. So we're no less committed to you. In fact, because we are committed, we want you to be aware of how we feel right now. And so their scores tended to be about 15 or 20% lower on average than new customers. And so it was really interesting to look at that. And that's where they did not know this until I got in there. I mean, they were looking at their data and they thought their membership was declining and all of this. And it really wasn't that bad because we understood the context of it. And so therefore we had two different scales basically to understand what type of customer are we looking at here. In the world of a different resort company that I worked with, on the employee side, they were having trouble with their employees being dissatisfied, not being able to, like the service employees, front desk, call center, not being able to sell. And the leadership at the corporate level is like, we need to get rid of these people because they can't upsell. And I went to the properties and talked to them and kind of did these one-on-one interviews for a while and really was able to pull it, and then did some training. And all of a sudden, a week after the training was done, they're at 400% more upsells than they had before. And fundamentally, the director comes back to me and says, what did you do? And I said, well, think about it this way. These people are making, let's say, $12, $13 an hour. You're asking them to do an upsell that costs $40 a night. That's equivalent to 3 to 4 hours of their work. They would never do that themselves if they were the purchaser. So they have no emotional connection and they're not engaged with selling that or offering that because it doesn't make sense. All I did was had them spend 5 minutes imagining what it would be like if they bought the upgraded room and how much fun they would have and all of this. And because they had that emotional experience, they could turn around and now offer it because it was no longer about their paycheck. It was about the experience they were having. It was all imagined too, which was even, I mean, they didn't even have to spend on the room, give the guests or the employees rooms to actually have the experience. We just did it in 5 minutes in a boardroom. And it was that fast. So if you really look at what's happening behind the scenes there, you've got to understand the context of what's actually going on in the employee's mind and what is correlated and what is causing. Very big difference. So that's one element of it. On the high standard side, I think that is an excellent point, Danny. And in fact, when I look at customer experience, I don't want to give away all my secrets here, but I'll give this one. I actually don't ask questions when I write a survey, typically. What I do instead on the customer, I make a statement. It's a bold statement, and I ask them if they completely agree or completely disagree. And I do that because, and this is one of the things that no one teaches you when you're learning how to write a survey. If I ask you how your experience was, I'm triggering one part of your brain which goes to the thinking logical mode. Whereas if I make a bold statement about how excellent it was and ask you to agree or disagree, you get an emotional reaction versus a logical reaction, which means I get a different answer when I ask them to tell me about their experience. And as a result, we actually get better data. Now, from an employee side, it would be different. I mean, there's going to be a different type set of questions or statements that you would want to make. But if I'm trying to evoke something in a customer experience, I'm going to make that emotion. I want to trigger that emotion to get the real story, because that's the story they're going to tell their friends and family when they get back home. So I try to push the standard as high as possible, honestly, is where I try to come from.
Great. And one thing I did not mention at the top of the call is if anybody has any specific questions for Danny or Tony, we will certainly have time at the end to get to those. So don't hesitate to put those into the chat as I kind of tee up the last question or two. So we've talked a lot about, the downsides and the good sides of collecting lots of data. Let's assume we've got an organization that has the right responsible data collection points throughout the employee life cycle, throughout the customer experience. How have you guys seen companies successfully integrate the two? Because I'm constantly telling my clients, don't look at this data in a silo, don't look at that data as a silo. Again, even if it comes from 10 different places, if it's the right data, let's pull it into our strategy and evaluate all pieces of the puzzle. So if you guys have any tips, tricks, examples of how that's been done well.
Well, the one thing I will say is I think that for what we see and the successful clients that we see is that there's a certain cadence that things are done in. And so I think it comes down to trying to determine how many times a year am I going to actually sit and really look at my data, really pull all of the different data sets that I've got and really focus on, okay, what, again, getting back to what we've been saying all along, what is my strategy? What's my objective? And so, for example, with employee retention, we find that clients sort of struggle because exit interviews we think are a big part of it. Well, those are ongoing. The data is constantly coming in, but that doesn't mean I have to look at it every day. It doesn't mean I need to look at it every month. But if I literally set aside on a quarterly basis, or maybe even just twice a year, and take my exit data, take my most recent engagement study, take any onboarding data I have, literally any data, and then I sit down very intentionally with trying to say, what are we going to do to improve employee retention? What can we take away from all these data sets? And then we very disciplined and very accountably develop action plans. And whether those are organizational wide, whether those are department level, that needs to be part of it. And I think sometimes in the employee engagement space, we do that okay. We go all the way through the action planning, but we find that that's not necessarily true with the fact that we're also collecting all this other data at different times of the year. And I think cadence is a key. It's like, okay, well, each quarter, or like I said, twice a year, we're going to have a very disciplined action planning process around an objective that we have as an organization, whether it's to improve the employee experience, whether it's to improve retention, whatever that is. And then be very focused and disciplined around it. And that's where we've seen companies actually have success.
I think that's a great point, Danny. The cadence is a huge piece on the customer side too, because you may have 100 or 1,000 times the number of customers that you have employees. And so you potentially have more data coming in. So the way we typically structure it, when I work with a company is we create this pyramid. At the bottom is tactical. At the midpoint is operational, which is kind of a departmental level. The top is strategic, and that's the positioning of the company and the branding and all of that. And so when we look at that, the cadence there would be, let's say I get an online review that comes back, or a survey, customer survey that just came back from a transaction. At the tactical level, we want action to be taken if there was a bad experience that can be resolved right there. Do we need to give money back? Do we need to handle a problem because it's still active? But then at the operational level, we come back, maybe it's monthly or quarterly, depending on the size of the company, how much data we have. And we say, okay, let's look at this from an operations perspective. What does this department need to be doing better? And then that's in context of a strategic perspective, which is what's the positioning of our company? And what I often see is that companies start at the tactical level and then operational and maybe get to strategic, but they're so wound up in solving the tactical day-to-day problems, they may not get to operational or strategic. So we come at it from a different perspective. We say, what's your strategic objective? Then your operations should fall out from that, and your tactical should fall out from that. So there are some companies where we do not recommend a day-to-day tactical interaction other than if there's a hot, really angry customer that needs to be dealt with for their particular moment in time. Other than that, we only do analysis maybe on a monthly or quarterly basis, because what we find is that leadership often, if they look too much at the data, they start to weave back and forth like this. And then the lack of consistency creates more problems than it actually solves. And so we'd rather have them make one good set of decisions on a monthly or quarterly basis, maybe at the operational level, maybe one good set of decisions on an annual basis from a strategic perspective, so we can actually see, did you execute against those decisions? And if you did, what was the result? Which I think kind of brings us back to the very beginning as we were talking earlier. So if you think about the cadence side of it, it depends on the amount of data. It depends on what your strategy is. It depends on who you're talking to and what you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I constantly telling my clients that do one or two things well this quarter, this half a year, and see the ROI, see the value, versus trying to do 7 things and not doing any of them well, and probably ending in a worse place because you've caused, you caused some ripples with these 7 things and you never followed through. So I'm certainly always preaching that principle. So with this will probably be our last question from me. Again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put those in the chat. But for a little bit, taking this tactically, we've talked about, having a lot of data, the spoils of riches. But at the end of the day, typically, the more data we're collecting, the more we're spending, right? You've got more vendors, you've got more engagement opportunities. So how would you advise somebody who maybe can't afford to do it all, but really needs to? They have retention problems in the customer and employee space, but really don't have a huge budget. What are your thoughts around getting kind of the most bang for your buck from a data survey perspective?
Well, let me start, Tony, because you and I have had this conversation before, and I'll be interested to see if you still believe it. So, but I'm a real believer in the value service chain, right? And if we get the employee experience right, if we have highly satisfied, highly engaged employees, then that is going to translate to generally happy customers and repeat customers and people that come back. So for me, I always say, let's focus on the employees first, and obviously focusing there and creating a great experience. So if I was going to make the suggestion, I would say we have to focus on the employee. But I would also say that, but also don't overdo it. In other words, let's not over collect data even from an employee perspective. And I think that we, from my perspective, again, being very specific to the fact that we know in the U.S. First-year turnover is a real challenge. So I think it's like last year when we did the retention report, 38% of all turnover happens in the first year. So we need to get that early stage right. I always think we need to understand why employees are leaving. And then I think once a year, at least once a year, every single employee needs to be able to provide some level of feedback in terms of their overall experience. I think you can do those 3 things and do them simply and easily and straightforward, and then have a couple of times a year that you're taking action on those items. I think you can be successful. But I want to see where you're coming at it, Tony, from the perspective of what would you do if you could only do one?
Honestly, it's interesting. We have done so many different research projects in different industries, and there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, it doesn't matter what industry it is. I will tell you that if it's 5-star reviews online, or if it's 10 out of 10 on your survey, whatever your tool you're using, it's the human to human connection, the employee to the customer, that by and far drives those top scores. And also you can very quickly tie that back, not just from a correlation, but from a causation perspective, to premium revenues. And so if I were to make a recommendation, it would be, you've got to look at that human to human connection. I'll be even more specific than just the employee experience. How do your employees and how do that customer really engage with one another? Because that moment right there is what makes the difference. And at some point, Danny, we'll have to come back and do another one, but I've created this whole model called the admiration equation. And it's, how do you drive or evoke, say it carefully there, how do you evoke admiration of goodness, admiration of skill, awe, and gratitude in your customers? And primarily the way to do that is by having the right human to human connection.
We've got a question from Daniel, one of our attendees. How is diversity playing a role into the data that we're receiving when it comes to both our customers and employees?
I mean, I've been going first a lot. I'm going to let you take this one first, and then I'll pipe in with some things on the equity and inclusion on the employee side.
Yeah, this is definitely a challenge, Daniel, and I appreciate the question. And let me outline a couple of the challenges that I see right now. If your survey tools and your survey data are not tied back to what you know about the customer, you may not know how diverse the population is that you're surveying, or if it is diverse. Let's take a couple examples. Really simple examples. A lot of surveys tools, and this is one of the upsides of some of these survey tools. A lot of survey tools can tell you what type of device the survey was taken on. If I'm taking a customer survey on a phone versus a computer, there's a big difference in how I'm going to type, the type of responses I'm going to get. I got to know that, because I can't treat the responses to a phone survey that have a big block of text asking for the story the same as I would from a computer. I've got to be aware of that. Now, how does that play into diversity? Well, in a number of ways. From an economic perspective, your customers may have computers, may have access to that. Well, look at what's happening right now with COVID and kids not being able to go to school, at least here in Nashville. They essentially wrote off the last quarter of school for Nashville public schools because a lot of kids don't have computers. And so if all you have access to is a smart device, or maybe you're of a generation that doesn't care about having a desktop or a laptop, and all you've got is a tablet or a phone, right? So from an age perspective, you look toward those smaller devices, you're going to respond differently. There's also the nature and how they speak, how they want to respond to questions, how they want to engage. We live in a culture now where Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and TikTok and you name it, that's how people are engaging. So are the tools keeping up in a way that are going to engage people or not? And I would very, very clearly say I don't think so. And so I think we have some biases built into the tools. Unfortunately, and full transparency, I don't know how to fix that myself, but I know the bias is there. And I think we need to do a better job from a customer experience perspective of understanding that bias. And the first step of that is really acknowledging that we don't even know how big the bias is, but yes, there is a bias. I'll stand on that ground.
Yeah, I think in the employee experience world, the one thing I'm seeing, and this is one of those things where I'm not going to say it's wrong, but it's not the order in which I would take them. So I think we're hearing a lot of people saying we need to do a specific survey or get specific feedback related to equity and inclusion from a certain population. Maybe it is the minority population. And to me, that's not where I would go to begin with. Where I would start to begin with is to look at the data that I have, to look at whether it be exit interviews, whether it be my engagement study. And the first thing I'd want to know is, are the perceptions of the questions that I ask of everybody different for those that meet a certain criteria related to, wanting to focus on equity and inclusion? Because I think it starts there first, is that, if I have someone who is a female, and let's say a female middle manager. Well, is that female middle manager having a different perception and experience than her counterparts, right? And so then it becomes important. Well, now I need to understand what those are, and then there may be follow-up surveys that might need to go out to try and tease out certain things of that different experience. But I think first and foremost, it needs to be seen: do we have a difference, right? Versus just getting feedback from those people that are maybe identified as being in a minority group. Well, what do I have to compare it to, right? Do I have anything to compare it to and understand it from there? So I think first is, let's not go get more data. Let's first see if there's a difference in the data sets that we have.
Great. Well, I know we've hit time. We are certainly happy to stay on. We don't have any more questions in the chat, but if you do have anything lingering, feel free to throw that in there. as we approach, again, the end of it, but we'll be happy to stay on and answer any other questions that are out there.
Yeah, Tony.
Tony, any final thoughts?
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun, Tony. I'm glad we finally got to do this, and you and I have connected on and off since we worked together. What we've decided now is over 20 years ago. But I think the one thing I wanted to finish up with is, again, the title of this program was really around, how do you drive value with survey tools? And I think we've kind of gone around those in a lot of different aspects. But to me, it comes back to some of the things that I think you said really well, which is, what is that strategy? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? What are we trying to do? And then let everything else follow from there. And let's not get so focused on, well, let's just go buy a survey tool, or let's just get continuous feedback. Let's make sure that we know what we're doing this for, whether it's getting customer feedback, whether it's getting employee feedback. Let's have a specific goal and objective in mind, and then we can go from there. And I think we're going to find that we're going to make better decisions, but also we're going to have value, not just from the tools that we may be buying or the services that we may be paying for, but also the time that our employees or customers are spending in giving us feedback is going to be seen as more valuable because we're actually doing something about it.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. And I think one of the rules of thumb that I have is that if we're going to work with a client and do any type of feedback research, the first question is, what metric do you want to move? And if their goal is just to improve satisfaction on the customer side, that's not enough for me. And I don't think it is on the employee side either. Just having happier employees. Yes, we've got to go there, but it's also about productivity. It's also about, revenue. There's other things that matter for the company. And I think looking at what the key performance indicators are for the company and which ones they really want to move and why do they want to move those, getting that clear will help create the context that you need to go ask those questions. Say, what's the right tool? What's the right approach? What's the right audience that we need to survey? And, kind of going back to the last question that was asked, but you put all of that in context, whether it's an employee, research that you're doing or it's customer research, it's looking for what's the variance in the data that tells me this versus that and why. We could look at all the tools that are out there. A lot of the tools tell us what, a measure, a metric, but they don't tell us why. And this is where I think the real value comes in. If you want to get the most value out of your surveys, out of your feedback, then you've got to be asking the why question. And that's not something that AI is yet ready to do. It's not something the tools are quite ready for yet. They may get there, but right now it really does take a level of expertise to really tease that out. So the question I would leave with is this. You may save money on going the DIY route, and it may be right for you at this point in time for asking the questions. But what opportunity are you missing by not having an expert come in there and do some work with you? And I say that because I look at some of the examples of clients I've worked for, and they were doing surveys before, they were doing great work before. When I came in there to work with them, they found ways to double their sales. The same would be true on the employee retention side, Danny. I mean, I can see it happening where, yes, they've improved their employee retention by a few percentage points every year. But what if they could have it? What if they could, do something? And if they knew what to do, they would already have done it. If the expertise resided within the company, they would already be doing that. And so that's why, turning outside for a moment and saying, well, let's at least bring someone in here to do an initial study for us to see what could happen. What opportunity are we blind to that we could actually take advantage of? That's where I think you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck.
Agreed. Well, thanks so much, Tony. I really appreciate your time today. You and I'll have to catch up later on here in the next couple of weeks and just catch up again.
Absolutely. Thank you, Danny. This was great. And thank you, Catherine, as well, for facilitating this.
No problem. Great to be here with you all. And thanks to all of our attendees. Hope everyone has a great rest of your day.